Hi guys, I've been doing a series on Orthodox Judaism, and today I want to address the topic, can you be Jewish and Christian? So most Jews that I talk to would say no, you can't be Jewish and Christian, and most Christians I talk to would say yes, you can be Jewish and Christian. So why is there such a disagreement? I actually think it's mostly based on misunderstandings and different definitions of terms. So, what I would say is yes, you can be Jewish and Christian, and no, you can't be Jewish and Christian, depending on how you're defining Jewishness. However, I do think that a lot of Jews have misconceptions about Christianity that lead them to believe that it is more divorced from Jewishness or Judaism than it really is. So today I want to cover why the New Testament is Jewish, how Jewish is Jesus, and can you be Jewish and Christian? So growing up, I didn't have any Jewish friends. Everything I knew about Jews came from the Bible. I knew Jesus was Jewish, I knew his disciples were Jewish, and I knew that they took the message of Christianity to the Gentile world. In college, I realized that Jews had a totally different perspective of Christianity. So I met a Jewish guy and we started having religious conversations. And he wanted to learn more about Christianity. So he asked me what he could read to learn more about my faith. And I told him to just start reading through the Gospel of John. So as he's reading, he told me that he was surprised at how Jewish the New Testament was because he was always taught that Christianity is a foreign religion that Gentiles bring to Jews to try to convert them and not the other way around. So first, I want to ask or answer the question, is Jesus Jewish ethnically and geographically? And I think that most people, even Jews, would acknowledge this, that Jesus was a Jew in that regard. So let me just share my screen and we'll look at a couple verses in the New Testament about how other people address Jesus and how he addresses himself. Okay, so this is John chapter 4. This is the story of the woman at the well. And it says in verse 3, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee, and he must needs go through Samaria. Then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called, I think that's, you pronounce that Sychar, I'm not sure, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, how is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. So right here you can see that she is addressing him as a Jew. So it's clear by his appearance, that he is a Jew, that he is not from Samaria, that geographically he does not belong to the people of Samaria, and she identifies him as a Jew. Now, later on in their discussion, Jesus actually identifies himself as a Jew. So let me go down. Okay, so he's talking to the woman and he says, ye worship you know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. So when he says we, then he says Jews. So he's identifying himself with the Jews. Okay, so just here you can see that both the woman and Jesus himself um, are claiming that identity of Jesus as a Jew. Okay, so what about culturally? So maybe Jesus is a Jew ethnically, but what about culturally? So there's a couple cool things that actually I didn't realize. These things are things I learned later. I didn't know what they meant because I'm not Jewish. So there's a couple things in the New Testament that have like, um, I guess are culturally Jewish things, and you don't always pick up on them when you're not Jewish. So I learned these things later. So in John chapter 10, verse 22, it says, and it was at Jerusalem the feast of the dedication, and it was winter. Now, I had no idea what the Feast of the Dedication was. I found out later that this is Hanukkah. So, Hanukkah actually means dedication in Hebrew. So, this is just kind of a side note in the middle of a story that Jesus is going to Jerusalem for the Hanukkah celebration, the Feast of Dedication. So, Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. Okay, there's another thing. This isn't actually about Jesus specifically, but just the New Testament in general, how the context is so Jewish. So in Acts chapter 1, verse 12, this is after the story of Jesus ascending from the Mount of Olives into heaven, and the disciples are returning to Jerusalem. And it says, Then returned they unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is from Jerusalem a Sabbath day's journey. So this is another thing I didn't know what it meant when I read it um, before I started having discussions with Jews. So one of my friends, I asked him, "Do you know what a Sabbath day's journey is? Because what does that mean that they're from Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey?" And he told me that a Sabbath day's journey is how far you're allowed to travel on the Sabbath day. It's a specific distance, about a kilometer. So this is something that the writer is just assuming you know, because the writer of the New Testament is writing to a Jewish audience. So in a Jewish place in Israel. So everybody knows what a Sabbath day's journey is. But me, being a Gentile, didn't realize that. So there's a lot of things in the New Testament that are so Jewish that even if you're Christian and you believe the New Testament, you might not even understand if you don't um, look into the context of these phrases. Okay, so New Testament is Jewish culturally. Jesus was Jewish both um, ethnically and culturally. What about religiously? So, did Jesus practice the law? Because you could live in Jerusalem, you could be ethnically Jewish and still not follow the law. So, let's answer that question. Was Jesus religiously Jewish? So, first, let's talk about his family. In Luke chapter 2, verse 21 and 24, this is after Jesus was born. It says, And when 8 days were accomplished for the circumcising of the child, his name was called Jesus, which was so named of the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days of her purification, according to the law of Moses, were accomplished, they brought to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male that openeth the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or two young pigeons. Okay, so you can see here that both Mary and Joseph are practicing the what is written in the law. So they're following the law of Moses. They are having Jesus circumcised, they're bringing a sacrifice, um, and they're redeeming him because he is the firstborn. Okay. Okay, what about when Jesus grows up? So, Jesus, what does he do on the Sabbath day? This is Mark chapter 1, verse 21. So, as an adult, it says, And they went into Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught. So, on the Sabbath day, Jesus is teaching in the synagogues. It's not Sunday, it's not in church. So the point is that the whole entire context of the New Testament is Jewish, and Jesus is practicing the law of Moses. He is observing the Sabbath, he is going to the synagogues and teaching, and even some of the later cultural traditions that are not based in anything in the Bible, like Hanukkah, Jesus is observing that as well. So you can see that Jesus, from pretty much anyone, I think, would say, based on these verses, that Jesus is very Jewish and the New Testament is very Jewish. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is in what way was Jesus not Jewish? So sometimes when talking about being a Jew, people are referring to a religious identity. Orthodox Jews believe that in order to obey the law of Moses, you must follow the traditions in the oral law. So if being Jewish means affirming Orthodox Judaism, then no, Jesus was not Jewish, and the New Testament is not Jewish, and Christianity is not Jewish, because Christianity rejects Orthodox Judaism, and Orthodox Judaism rejects Jesus. So these things are incompatible. So what I want to do now is show you some verses where Jesus explicitly rejects the oral tradition, and we'll also look at where some of these traditions are later written down in the Talmud, which I just think is pretty interesting. Okay, so in Mark chapter 7, we have a discussion between Jesus and the Pharisees over the traditions. Now, the Pharisees, or I should say the rabbis, the modern day rabbis, are the successors of the Pharisees. So when you see these discussions between Jesus and the Pharisees, you can think of it as Jesus discussing things with Orthodox Jews, because Orthodox Jews trace their tradition back to the Pharisees. So it says, then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. I also find this verse interesting because it says, and all the Jews. So even sometimes in the New Testament, they'll use the word Jew to refer to the followers of the tradition. So it can be, I can see why this can be confusing to people because clearly, if the disciples are Jewish, they're not doing what all the Jews are doing. So here, when it says all of the Jews, it doesn't mean um, necessarily everybody who would consider themselves a Jew, but it means the Jews who are following the religion of the Pharisees. Okay, so it says, and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. And when they came from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be which they have received to hold, as the washing of cups and pots and brasen vessels and of tables. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? He answered and said unto them, well hath Esaias, this is the same as Isaiah, well hath Esaias prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. So this is where Jesus and the Pharisees differ. Jesus says that the Pharisees are teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. That the rule to wash before you eat is not a command of God, but they're treating it as if it was. So these traditions were not written in the time of Jesus. They weren't written down as far as I know. But they were written down later in the Talmud in a few centuries later. So I want to actually look at where this same tradition is written down to compare. So this is discussing a similar thing. It says, and after Rabbi Yahashua related to him the entire incident, Rabbi Akiva said to him, give me water so that I may wash my hands. Rabbi Yahashua said to him, the water that I brought will not suffice for drinking. How will it suffice for washing your hands? He said to him, what can I do for transgressing the words of the sages and eating without first washing hands? One is liable to receive the death penalty. And if so, it is better that I should die my own death by thirst rather than transgress the opinion of my colleagues who enacted that one must wash hands before eating. So here it just shows the importance they put on washing hands before eating. And this is the same tradition that Jesus is referring to. Okay, I want to read a little bit further on in Mark chapter 7. So Jesus then references another tradition. So it says, "For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups, and many other such like things ye do. And he said unto them, Full well you reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition." So this is an interesting point Jesus is making. He's not just saying that they have these extra traditions that they are holding equal to God's commands, but that they're actually rejecting God's commands in keeping their tradition. And he gives an example. He says, "For Moses said, Honor thy father and thy mother, and whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, If a man shall say to his father or mother, It is Corban, that is to say, a gift, by which thou mightest be profited for me, he shall be free. And ye suffer him no more to do aught for his father or his mother, making the word of God of none effect through your tradition, which ye have delivered, and many such like things do ye." So this is an interesting one. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but this verse was always really confusing to me until I found it in the Talmud. So, what is he talking about them saying it is Corban? Um, what does this have to do with honoring your mother and father? So, there is a rule that we're going to look at that says if you say to some type of item, it is Corban, you are saying it is like a gift that would be offered at the temple. And if it is an offering, then it's forbidden to be take any benefit from. So what Jesus is saying is that let's say you have something that your mom or your mother or father could profit from. And instead of giving it to your mother and father and honoring them, you decide to make it forbidden. And to make it forbidden, all you have to do is call it Corban. And once you say Corban, you are vowing that this is forbidden to you and anybody else. So Jesus is saying if you do that in this situation, you are keeping your own tradition about these special words instead of honoring your father and mother. So let me go ahead and show you this in the Talmud. So it says, when an individual takes a vow, he renders an object forbidden to himself or to others as though it were a sacrificial offering. This parallels the act of consecrating an offering, which also renders an item forbidden for personal use by means of a verbal declaration. The most direct expression of a vow is when an individual says, This object is forbidden to me, or to others, like an offering. Additionally, the Mishnah states that all substitutes for the language of vows are like vows. Consequently, if one states that an object is forbidden to him, like a konam, instead of like an offering, korban, the vow takes effect, as konam is a substitute for the word korban. Okay, so here it's just basically stating the tradition that when you say something is Corban, you're saying it's forbidden. And Jesus was saying that people were using this to get out of honoring their parents with the things that they had, things that they could have given to their parents to honor them. They instead would call it Corban, and that would make it forbidden. And so they're putting their tradition above the command to honor your mother and father. Okay, so I want to look at one more thing before I summarize the discussion, and that is how the Pharisees viewed people from their own group who followed Jesus. So in John chapter 12, verse 42, it says, Nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Okay, so you can see there that From the start, the Pharisees did not accept Jesus, and they put people out of the synagogues who believed in him. So from the beginning, there has been a divide between Orthodox Judaism and Christianity. So, in some ways, when a Christian says you can be Jewish and Christian, I think that it undermines the what a Jew who is in Orthodox Judaism would have to give up to be a Christian. From the beginning, Orthodox Jews had to give up a lot to follow Jesus. They were no longer accepted, they were put out of the synagogues. So the religious establishment did not recognize Christianity as authentic. Um, on the other hand, if you tell a Christian that their religion is foreign to Judaism, we saw just from reading the context that this is not true at all. So that is misleading. So you can't actually practice Orthodox Judaism as a Christian because you're not even allowed to. However, it's confusing to Christians to say that Christianity is a Gentile religion, since it started as an entirely Jewish movement. So I hope this clears up some misunderstandings and misconceptions so that Christians and Jews can have more productive conversations going forward.